Hey all, this is an SNS guide. It's been a little bit longer than I would have liked to get out this guide. There's a lot of like really weird testing with SNS. If you actually look at the giant chart I put out the other day, and in terms of like what's better, if Fortify is better, if Flame conditioning is better, or Elemental Aversion, there's like a lot of weird conditionals with this class. I'm gonna try to explain it as best as I can, but this is a basic flow chart of like what you should be playing, kind of depending on your style. I'd say in general, I'm going to be talking a bit more about the heavy builds, not the kind of cheese-oriented 3v3 OPR builds, but the cheese 3v3 OPR and even dual builds with SNS are very, very strong. It's very hard to deal with. Has a lot of ways to heal itself, has a lot of ways to shut people down, and kind of set up for infinite combos even with some of these builds. But the war builds in particular, I'm going to be talking about because that's what I mostly geared towards. These war builds can be played in OPR. Like if you have a healer then I would consider going for one of these builds in OPR, and you could just hard carry with it basically. So getting into it, in terms of like what you're looking for with SNS, this is gonna get kind of weird with the math really fast. But for the shield, based off the math that I looked at, Sturdy Fort is still better than doing something like flame conditioning on your shield. Uh, I do flame shield ward, and then I would do sturdy. The flame shield ward's a little bit variable. The sturdy I still think is really good because that will basically allow you to hold your block more. And at the end of the day, if you're blocking damage, you're not really taking damage. So it's a really good way to prevent damage being done. I think there is an argument for dropping the sturdy and instead putting in another flame conditioning on your shield, which yes, you can do. I just am not 100% sold on it at the moment. In general, it seems like with this build that you're not really going to be taking a lot of fire damage. I was testing on PTR dueling people with no resil, just 2 per gear, and it was lights out, just very easy to beat people with any sort of build with that kind of setup. And this is going to be a build that takes advantage of it. On your armor itself, I think you still want 5 resil. I'd say 2 physical version. I'll get into the details later when I go into like these native attributes and like what you should be putting on here in terms of gems. But the actual shield itself is basically has passive elemental version, has 10% passive, so I don't think you need to do too much elemental version on this. I do a little bit of physical aversion. I have a feeling that bows are going to go back to Rain of Arrows pen shot kind of meta, and those are going to be hitting a lot harder than fire staffs just based off how easy it is to ward to fire staff compared to bow. Because the way wards work to physical, you have to ward for specific. If you ward for specifically thrusts, are going to be weak to other things. I don't think there's many other elementals that are or elements that are scary. Void Blade on point is very weak to people blocking. Like it's a very common tactic versus a Void Blade if you're an experienced player to literally just hold block even with a life staff or something like that, and they're just literally not able to do any damage to you because Void Blade is so shit at breaking block. Compared to SNS, it's like it's a joke. The Void Blade's not ever going to break your shield. So I don't think you really have to worry about that too much. I think the bows are a little bit more scary because Rain of Arrows can hit you over your shield. Pen shot will not go through your shield, but if you're unaware, it can still hurt a lot. In general, I don't think you're super worried about dying with this build. I think it's possible to cut some of these out for more refreshing ward, but I don't think it's really needed to have much more refreshing ward because every time you block an attack, that basically counts as a 1% extra refreshing ward. And then every time you take 4 attacks with this, you'll get 5 refreshing ward with the setup I have, or 5% cooldown reduction. I think you could up that a little bit more and then drop a little bit more flame conditioning, but flame conditioning seems really strong, and I'll go through that in a second. So that's the base reason why I think you want some physical version. Elemental version, I think is really good. You probably want both of these over Shirking Fort next patch. Based off of test, about 20% Fortify will equate to about 6% actual Fortify, like for your character, if that makes sense. Which is why that Sturdy Fortification is still good. Because basically 20% free Fortify that's up all the time tends to be a little bit better than like a conditional like Flame conditioning. I'd run 1 Sturdy Energy. This will be on your chest piece. I'd run a Fortified Shield Rush because this is like 5 or 6% effective general resistance, which can be good versus melees. It also restores your stamina when you hit this, so it's just solid. I would do however many secondary weapon perks that you need, and then I would fill the rest with Flame Conditioning personally. This also could be refreshing ward. Flame conditioning feels like on point that it will be very easy to proc consistently because it procs off of chain. It does not proc off of dots, but it procs off of AoEs and it procs off a chain. That seems like it will be a very, very constant on point between Blunderbuss and Fire Stuff to be happening. So I would consider this flame conditioning to be up almost all the time, and it seems generally worth it to run from testing. The other thing with flame conditioning that is that it falls under this ABS column, which if you haven't seen my last video, watch that to understand what this means more. But basically, this is old Fortify. It also is 4.9%, even though it says it's 4% for some reason. So it's like really closer to 5%. I don't know, that the actual perk icon thing is a little bit bugged. But this tends to be pretty good. It is noteworthy that you can't like reproc it while the actual buff is still active, but it seems like it will be up for the majority of the time and seems like a very effective buff. It is significantly better than Elemental Aversion versus Fire, but that is about the only thing with it that's super significant. The other thing that's really significant about SNS is even though this says passive allies for defensive formation, I tested that on PTR and live, and it does apply to yourself as well. So as long as you're holding your shield up, you're going to be taking 30% less damage, no matter if you're on PTR or live, which is incredibly broken, but that's a little bit noteworthy as well, because once you get to this 50% mark, you are capped. But it is noteworthy that Void Gauntlet and only Void Gauntlet is actually able to strip that down a little bit. So you're really trying to hit to like 65% elemental stuff to fire. So that's like your big goal. So you're trying to get to about 0.4 or 0.35 fire resistance or 35% fire resistance off from stuff other than defensive formation. The actual elemental version won't really help with that, but flame conditioning will, as well as fire ward on your shield. So that's the base idea of like what this is going for. When like once you get to this part where it's at 0.5, then that's when Fortify actually extends you above how tanky you were last patch, and you'll just basically not be able to die to Fire Staff at all because you have 20k base HP with this build. So getting into more in depth, and on your sword, Plague Strikes, Trenchant Rend, I think is a go for, or go to. Third perk doesn't really matter that much. I rock a 2 perk one, I don't really care, but if you do care, I'd say Sure Footing is the best thing because it'll allow you to move a little bit faster while you're blocking. I think Chain's also not awful. There's not many like insane third perks that you can get. The reason why Trenchant Strikes, Trenchant Rend is, in my opinion, best. I think Trenchant Rend's a little bit, well, it is worse on PTR than it is on live significantly, like versus a light player. This will only equate to like 1 or 2% damage. But the base idea of like why this is really good is that you can apply both of these debuffs with one heavy attack that also strips a buff off of, or a debuff off of you with the SNS tree that I'll show you guys in a bit. And then you could swap off your SNS and swap back to it, and you could do it over and over, and it kind of ignore the passive cooldown that's on here inherently. It seems like it's been a bug, but it has been a bug for a long time. So at this point, I treat it as a mechanic because they're not fixing it for some reason. So that's why Trenchant Rend, I think, is really good with the sword. You're not really playing for this for damage, you're playing it for util. Rend tends to be a little bit better versus people who are really, really tanky, which is also noteworthy, so you want to be trying to aim this towards the heavy players on the actual PTR patch itself. But that being said, Plague Strikes is also really good for preventing people from healing back up, because that's like a 25% disease that you land every single time. So, and that's a perk that you don't have to swap off your shield to get up again. You also have Grit when you go for this on the PTR, which makes it inherently very, very good. This is something I'd be trying to go for if I am trying to regen my Stam onto PTR, basically at all times. On your Amulet, I think health is really essential. I'd do slash protection or some sort of protection that's in the meta. I don't know if slash damage is actually going to be really significant. Just looking more and more at Great Axe Warhammer, the more I feel like it's just completely shit. The actual Warhammer stun off of testing, like the Sundering Shockwave, before that would cause you to take 15% increased damage and it would land a bunch of debuffs on you. It still lands a bunch of debuffs on you, but it really only increases the damage you take by like 2 to 3% now on the PTR, which is like nothing. I don't really see a world where Warhammers run a ton, so I'd just be looking for Slash and Thrust Ward from a physical perspective, and Fire Ward from an elemental. It is noteworthy that Ice Spike does count as a physical attack, and so does Void Blade. Void Blade you can block very easily. Ice Spike you could also block very easily, but those are two things that will skirt around your elemental aversion, so you have to be a little bit worried about that, I guess. Actually, I don't think it gets around the passive 10% elemental damage reduction, but it does get around elemental aversion. So you are a little bit protected to it, but not super protected to it. That being said, you are the most tanky build in the game, and you probably won't die anyways. On your ring, I think you went Hearty, Refreshing Ward, Enfeabling is what I would go for. The Enfeabling It's less necessary. I think it's nice to have 2 to 4 refreshing ward, I would say. Right now, this is set up for 2. I think this flame conditioning could be less and could be replaced with refreshing ward. I think flame conditioning is a little bit better, but it's like very, very marginal. Basically why flame conditioning is good is it works as old fortify, so and it seems fairly likely that it will be a consistent proc if you're on point in a fire staff meta. So it seems like it will be okay. Uh, Getting to attributes, big surprise here. You want all the con you can get on your ult. I think you want Vines or Bile or Stalwart Stoneform, depending on what you're playing it in. If you're playing an OPR, I really like the Stalwart Stoneform if I am in solo queue. If I am with a group, I tend to go for Vines or Bile. Vines on live seems very, very good. On PTR, I think it's a toss-up. The actual Rend on Vines won't be good, but the weakening on Vines will be good. Uh, so you could go for like the Fortifying Vines. I think is kind of an option there. I don't think the brutal vines on the PTR is actually super effective, but the fortifying vine seems like it will be okay because it's like 5% extra fortified something, or the life stealing vine seems okay as well. I think Bile in general seems a little bit more appealing to me personally on the PTR, but I think it's kind of a preference between these 3 ults. Uh, the fortify will not do that much because it is old fortify, but that is kind of a aside. And secondaries, in terms of what you want, there are a lot of different options. I showed that like flow chart at the beginning. Kind of depends what game mode that you're looking at too. Uh, but in general, these are the ones that are tend to be a little bit better. I think IG, well, actually, the Warhammer I wouldn't really consider anymore. The main reason why Warhammer was even considered before was you could get refreshing ward on it, so it was just something. But Sundering Shockwave doesn't do anything, so I'm going to take that off this list. It just doesn't do enough for it to be viable, in my opinion. Armor Breaker also doesn't really do anything next patch, so there's a lot of things that they have kind of broken with their Fortify Rend change. They probably need to fix that in order for a lot of these perks to be viable again. But in terms of IG, what you want, this is the one class in the game I would probably go for Healing Tomb because I don't think you're going to be on it that often. And usually go to IG, you break out of it when people are on you, and the little bit of extra health actually kind of does come into play. I'd probably put Keen Speed on it, and then Keen, and then put Pylon Burst on your armor. I think there is a world where you could put Pylon Burst on your IG and just kind of put a flame conditioning on your armor and not really worry about the heal. Pylon Burst will just allow you to get your ult a lot faster. There's also a mechanic here that I'll talk about later where Pylon basically could be used so that you could continue to block all the time with SNS if you play it right. On your Void Gauntlet, if you do that as a secondary, I do Keen, Scream, and then Preference, but Keenly Jagged is probably the best thing that you can get because you're not going to be on your Void Gauntlet super often, and one extra dot that you get off of that can help you get ult a little bit faster. It's not that big of a difference, to be honest, between Keenly Jagged and the 2-perk VG, because the VG already applies dots passively, but if you're looking at the best thing that you possibly could get, that's still probably the best thing you possibly can get. On your Hatchet, I'd say refresh if you're gonna do that. That's more of a OPR setup. The main con with Hatchet is if you're diseased, it will apply that effect after you get the health proc. The PTR health proc on Hatchet, for those of you who don't know, is half your actual max HP. So the reason why this is significant is because you have 20k HP, right? So this is a 10k heal if you don't have disease on you. So if you're about to go down, you pop a cleanse pot and then you get this defy death to proc, then you're just back up at 10k HP. You'll probably be able to live. It doesn't seem like it actually kind of seems interesting. If you're gonna run this, I would do it in a way where you're running social distancing and infected throw, because those are the 2 best util perks. Rending throw again doesn't really do anything because this is new Rend, not old Rend. Void Gauntlet's the only a weapon in the game that has access to old Rend, and that's why Void Gauntlet I think will be really good alongside SNS. But you should be probably going for social distance throw. It's just kind of an escape tool, and infected throw to land a disease and a weaken. When disease and weaken are both really good debuffs that you can have on the next patch. The berserk does not matter that much. The main thing that's significant about this is it acts as a freedom that you can proc all the time, similar to Stoneform, so you can kind of get out of a sketchy situation with that. All right. Moving on. With those things on your native attributes, this is like what you have passively. These 40%. So if you're holding block, you have 30% old fortify, and you have 10% base elemental damage reduction. This 10% is not the same thing as old Fortify, but is similar. Basically, if you didn't watch the last video, it works as a way to kind of mitigate empowers that the opponent has. You could think of it sort of as like a everyone that hits you applied weaken, if you will. It's coded the same way, so it's pretty good. It's not the best, but it's a pretty good ability. It's the same reason why Elemental version and Physical version are being run next patch, except you get 10% Elemental for free because you have an SNS, which is kind of nice. In terms of everything else, I think you will end up with 8 to 12% Elemental or Physical damage reduction from your aversion. If you block an attack, that doesn't really matter. It's for when AoEs get thrown at you that you could just live and not really have to worry about it. I don't think you'll really be dying that much with SNS in general next patch, but there's not much better things to get. So I think it still makes sense to play for as a survivability and try to bait yourself a lot next patch. In terms of slash damage, what I think that's like an optional thing. Thrust might be better. It might be fire. The main thing is that you want to try to get as much of this gem setup as you can, and you have to be able to mitigate the passive Void Gauntlet ones next patch. You're going to start at 0.3 because you're on SNS and you're inherently a little bit broken in that regard. So you're looking just to get 0.2 plus 0.15, so 0.35 to other things. I think if you run 15% elemental resistance, it's really easy to get there versus fire. It's really easy to get there with your flame conditioning as well. So it's just kind of juggling that a little bit. There's also an aspect where some people are considering not doing all flame conditioning, maybe do some void conditioning, because void gauntlets are not affected by this elemental version. So that'd be a way to kind of mitigate that. I would argue with SNS it's kind of an exception because it's really easy to block void gauntlet damage, and they don't really do anything at that point. So I think it makes sense just to play for the block personally. But that's kind of that setup. And then this is the funny conditional. If you're Ice Gauntlet, I think you actually go all stamina recovery stuff in your Rune Glass. The reason why is every time that you land a hit, within 3 seconds, you'll get 8% stam, not 8 flat stam. So it's a little bit more than that because I have 110 stamina. So basically, that's just a way to constantly hold block. It's not as good as old Void Gauntlet Aura if you look back at that, but it is still something that is noteworthy and is pretty helpful. So if I look at the live patch Void Gauntlet Aura, this is 15% stamina per second. So it's going to be 8% stamina per 3 seconds. So it's a lot worse than that, but it's still a way to kind of hold your shield up consistently. If you're not doing that kind of setup, I don't know if it's worth it or not, but it doesn't seem like it's a bad idea considering you only lose 2.5% uh, resistance, and in turn for that, you gain more stamina. So that's kind of a balancing thing that I think is more of a preference. And then I would do 12.5, depending if you're doing that setup or not, with the stamina recovery to 15% opals, and then I would do some physical. It's possible for some of this stuff to change. I just imagine that we're in a super uh, elemental heavy meta. So if you actually look at like all the stuff that you're getting on top of the bonuses, you're going to be really, really stacked against fire. Fire is not going to hit you for anything. Physical will hit you for a little bit more, but it seems like physical weapons in general are super, super weak. I think Great Axe Warhammer people will try to run it, but I don't think it's particularly good. I think I'm more scared about Spear at this point, which is why I would consider doing a thrust thing instead of a slash, because I think Spear will actually hit harder than Great Axe will with its perks and whatnot, and will be a little bit more annoying. So yeah, that's where I'd say for this class, like where you should go. SNS, if I haven't made it clear already from past videos, I think it is the best primary weapon out of any weapon on the PTR by a long shot. I think this is like extremely broken compared to everything else, basically just because it gives this old 30% fortify to everyone, including yourself, and no one else can compete close to that. So basically, if you want to look at this in terms of the chart perspective that I showed everyone yesterday, most people would do like say they're doing a 10-10 split, like an average like light player would have 110% health. If they're playing with an SNS, they're gonna have 160% like base health. So that's like an extra 50% base health that you have just for playing with an SNS, and then everything else stacks on top of that. You add in a little bit of flame conditioning, a little bit of or you add in your elemental aversion, you add in some flame conditioning, and that's where you start seeing things where it's like, hey, I'm a heavy player. I don't run any fortify. I have 300% base max HP, not including like your actual max HP. So this basically is equivalent to about 60k effective HP is like what you would be consistently at. It's possible to even get this a little bit higher if you had some fortify on top of that. You get up to here, like you actually have your passive fortify from like if you have shield rush or if you have the uh, when you block attacks, you gain fortify, sturdy fortification. It gets up a little bit higher. It doesn't seem that significant, but the slope is a lot better than it was, or a lot steeper than it was before. You land a weaken, this goes up even higher. You have a 20% weaken on your SNS, so it seems very, very good overall. In terms of SNS tree, which I haven't talked about yet, let's go back to PTR. Let's go to sword. This is what I currently run on SNS. It won't make a ton of sense until you kind of start playing it. The shield rush and the shield bash, they're basically just ways to get more stam back because you gain 15 stam every time you hit someone with that. And that's when you hit a target. It's possible to AoE with these, from my understanding, so you can get stam back really, really fast with these abilities. I basically everything on this right tree is kind of standard. The off standard thing is the leaping strike. I think Defender's Resolve is really, really good. If you actually look at Defender's Resolve, it does apply that like AoE like weaken when hit kind of bonus that I talked about earlier. But the problem I have with Defender's Resolve is the actual animation is super, super long, and more often than not, I find myself when I cast this ability, I tend to die immediately if I do not get it off before I get chunked. And usually when I'm looking to cast this, I'm already getting chunked. So if I cast this, I'm just kind of dead. And if I do cast this early, it often tends to get stripped because NA and my servers right now in the meta, people are running 12 to 14 Void Gauntlets, and that will just get stripped. And it's a very long animation. It gets stripped with a very long cooldown. It does not feel super, super good. I tend to find myself surviving a lot better if I can just leaping strike out of the clump, or if I could use the leaping strike to offensively position for my secondary, which is often Void Gauntlet on the live patch. But on the PTR, I might try something else. I still think Void Gauntlet is my preferred thing, though, because it is able to apply that old Rend, which is very, very strong. I don't think it's as strong it was what it was on live, but it's something to kind of play around with. I know some other people have been trying Spear with Cyclone to get your stand back instantly. I'd argue that your actual shield abilities can do that as well, but it seems like an interesting idea. I think it can work as well, where if you do something a Cyclone, if you were to do that setup, I'd probably look at maybe dropping Perforate, because I don't think you'll be able to get it off super often, and then this would be more of a weakened kind of clump util, and then you block as more of a secondary sort of thing. I think that could also work out pretty, pretty well. There's a lot of things that you can kind of customize with in terms of like weapons. I think this is where people will be playing around a lot. But SNS itself seems like a very, very powerful thing because of that AoE 30% fortify. It is like a relatively small range of 3 meters, but it's still such a strong buff that I think it makes sense to run 2 to 3 of these builds the next patch if it stands this way, just because no one else can compete with that kind of effective HP, and it will basically just mean that you win every clump fight effectively. If you want to think about it from a mathematical perspective, you could slot like, let's say another Great Axe Warhammer, or you could slot this and give everyone else that is around this player like an extra 30% uh, HP effectively. So I think it makes more sense to slot the SNS. The SNS will also apply weakens, which will again put that up to 50% effective HP because the weaken applies 20%, and then everything builds on top of that base. So I think it just makes a lot of sense to slot a lot of SNSs next patch, and it makes a lot of sense because the util on SNS is just super, super high. It would also be able to live versus range very well because you could just block ranged attacks and then they won't do damage to you. So yeah, that's kind of the spiel about SNS. Seems very, very good. Uh, would not be surprised if this takes over the meta and gets nerfed immediately without any block changes, which they have been saying for a while would come through. So, yep, that's it for this one, and I'll see you guys in the next video.